Greetings and welcome to Ancestral Conversations. My name is Alexandra Shimina, and I've been doing this since 2020, talking, interviewing, and having deep, lovely conversations with practitioners of various modalities of work, but who in some ways either work or use the ancestral lens for themselves and for their work. So somehow adding the ancestral healing, ancestral practices into their existence and the way they see life. And today I have a privilege of talking to Margot Harrison, whom I met through Dan van Kampenhout work, the systemic ritual work. And I'm really admiring and respecting the way Margot sees the world and works with ancestral practices. And I would like to pass it on to Margot so that you can introduce yourself a bit more, Margot.
Well, hello. It's lovely to be here, Alexandra. And as you've said, we met through our teacher, Dan. I follow your work a lot as well, and I've attended your workshops, and we've worked together individually. And you bring an aspect of that systemic work um, that I don't incorporate in a lot of the work I do. I work mostly as a shamanic practitioner, but I really like the systemic work and the way that it shows a different aspect of working shamanically. But I mostly do the systemic work for myself. I was born and brought up in the west of Ireland. But for many years, I lived in the west of England. So I swapped one west for another west. But anyway, and I had most of my working life in the UK. That's where we had our children and where I did my shamanic training. Um, And when myself and my husband retired, we decided we'd move back to the west of Ireland. Now, I wasn't all that keen on doing that, to be honest. I had my life where I was, which I enjoyed very much. But there was something about the ancestors drawing me back to the land of my birth that seemed very important. I had a bit of resistance around that, but I listened to them. We moved back here, and that thing of being on the land of my birth and my family's on both sides, my mother's and my father's side, um stretch quite far back in Ireland. So I am really rooted in my ancestral lineage here. I have a shamanic practice here. I teach some classes as well. Um, and I find that my body, once I moved back and I started doing the work here again, something in my body relaxed. There was a familiarity, and there were a whole load of layers I didn't have to go through in order to do the work. The just being here enabled me to go deeper.
So you heard the call of the ancestors and came back to the land.
And I didn't listen to them for a long time. However, the ancestors and the spirits of the place have a way of insisting that certain things happen, and that the gifts that we're given by our lineage, that um, how those gifts need to be seen and those gifts need to be used. So being here, I am connected back to my family and what they dealt with in terms of religious persecution, colonialism, famine, and all those things that have affected this country in the way that it has. And the importance of working in a way where there is compassion for both the victims and the perpetrators, and the compassion for the stories that come out in the people and the stories that comes off the land.
I immediately have a number of questions from what you've just said. One question that I'm interested in that you mentioned is the gifts being passed on from the lineage, from the ancestors, need to be used, need to be utilized, need to be shared with the world. And I came across that in my work as well with people where the gifts were not used by the ancestors. And because of that break, because of that disconnection, it didn't flow forward easily. So those in the current generation can't really claim it fully as I am able to show up fully, because somewhere for generations that was not possible, especially for women, often living fully their gifts and their wisdom and their and showing up fully was not safe or possible. So we somehow are in these shoes, and for us it may be a bit more safe and a bit more possible, but like a block that it's not happening. Tell me a bit about that. How does that show up for you, and how is that connected with the ancestral work? And I know with your lineage where you are working with the women of the lineage and them showing up in life.
I consider myself very fortunate that I am able to work in the way that I do. I give credit to the women in my lineage, those very feisty Irish women who enabled it for me to to be the way I am and to do this sort of vocational work in the way that I do. They didn't have easy lives, the women, but neither did the men. And in that sort of colonial existence that my ancestors had, the men weren't able to protect the women in the way that was needful for them to do. So while most of my work is with the women, the way in which men were treated is also part of the story, and how the gifts were not passed down. Lots of people I know don't know that I work in this way. You're somebody who sort of lives on the edge of the community, and who people come to when it's needful for them to have some work done, okay, or for their story to be heard. And a lot of what I do is about listening to the stories, and listening to the stories that come through the bodies of the people. And it's their stories, but it's also the stories of the people who have come before them, and how these stories get repeated. And how sometimes it's just an acknowledgement of what has happened that is needed. But sometimes there is some sort of work that is needed in order to straighten the lines, or to get rid of some of what we say in systemic work, the entanglements. And it's that thing of like going through the knots and sort of undoing the knots and being patient about undoing the knots, because sometimes you have to work very carefully so that the body isn't forced to give up what it isn't able to give up in this moment. So it's that very sensitive removing of the layers that's important. But again, the only way you can do that is through listening to the stories. So when somebody comes to me, they'll spend an hour talking before we get to doing any sort of work at all. and the story just keeps. And sometimes I hear the same story from the same person, but you hear a different version of it. And having my ancestors present, as our teacher Dan says, those ancestors who look on us with kind eyes, having those present and near is what's important. And being able to bring those ancestors who look on the client with kind eyes, to bring those in as well, also sort of adds to it adds strength to the field.
This leads me nicely to the question about what actually are ancestors.
Well, for me, the ancestors, for years, I was brought up in the west of Ireland. I was brought up, in a Catholic household, and and there were still sort of aspects of the old ways in which the people of the place approached things. So the dead were very present in the living, and the way in which the funerary rites are in Ireland are, even now, it's quite amazing the way in which people are waked, and the stories are told, and the person who has died is held in a space for 3 days of being talked to and looked at, and people come in, and they my mother, her anniversary is coming up in the next few days, and when we waked her in the house, and people would come in and they'd look at her and say, "Oh, doesn't she look great?" And then they would tell the stories about her, and how they met her and how much she meant to them. And so the person who died is very much present. But even beyond that, then we visit the graves. Mass is said in the graveyards every year. So the direct ancestors are very present. What we didn't have so much was that thing of where we had that sort of animistic connection. So that thing where spirit is in everything. So everything is potentially an ancestor. The land is an ancestor. The trees are ancestors, stones, mountains, rivers. Okay, we had sort of moved away from that slightly, but we still had that connection to the direct ancestors, which is good. So when I came to explore this work, it was there was a bit of a light bulb moment, because the traditional culture, that sort of animistic pagan culture that eroded by fundamentalist Catholic outlook on things. Um, um, it suddenly sort of came back together for me, and I sort of felt that deep sense of connection then, that it wasn't just me and my direct family, that there was so much beyond that. And there's the two sides of that. There's the one side where there is this huge resource where we can go to ask for whatever help it is that we need. But there's the other part of that where there are the ancestors who haven't lived good and happy lives, who need their stories to be heard. And I'm always very circumspect about using the word healing the ancestors, because I'm not sure that that's our job. Our ancestors lived their lives, but it's our job to facilitate the healing in ourselves, whereby they are seen. And I think a lot of what happens in our society is where we're out of kilter and out of relationship with each other, but also with the land around us.
Yes, I I very much agree, and I'm glad you brought this up, this um, idea of ancestral healing or healing the ancestors as something that is a little bit too grandiose for the children to do for the ancestors.
Totally. Yeah.
And systemically, we know this well, that the first ones are the big ones, and us, the last ones, are the small ones.
Yeah.
Kind of doing this reverse movement is
Mm.
against our own um, good future, where we're looking forward. But that the healing that we are doing is the healing of our relationship with them,
Yes.
kind of remembering that there is a relationship, that we are not isolated, that we are not kind of just us and just the present moment and nothing else matters. And the present moment where healing happens, but it's definitely not the only moment because it ripples out both ways. And this returning to the relationship with the past, with the ancestors, and with the future, with those 7 generations where you would still have an impact,
Yeah.
is the healing that we're doing. That by healing within ourselves, we're also healing that connection, that relationship, allowing, as you said, the stories to be heard, the entanglements to be released, the flow to be restored in some ways.
Mhm.
Mm.
In one of your meditations I did a while ago, the it was, I mean, I had worked this way before, but this was very impactful for me. The way in which you spoke about seeing yourself as the ancestor and seeing the descendant looking back at you. And I saw my descendant clearly looking back at me, and she had sort of a bit of surprise on her face. um, but that was really impactful for me in that we have that direct relationship with 7 generations on, but much further as well. But as you say, the 7 generations is um, where where we can have the most impact by living the lives we do.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The way I look at it, 7 generations is where what we do impacts them, and then beyond is where we come into this category of the ancient ones, or
Yes.
the well ones, and I think it's such an interesting um band on seeing yourself in this life, in this existence on this planet, when you consider that at this moment you are building yourself as the ancient ancestor,
Yeah.
that for some time in the future, whether you have children or whether you don't have children, whether they know anything about you, your ripples will still be out there. Your energy, your decisions, your choices, it will still all be out there creating their reality in,
Yeah.
in a very kind of real way. Um, like we know we are being impacted by what was happening 7 and beyond generations ago. I think that's magical when you put yourself into this
Mm.
much wider context and container of existence. Plus the other than humans.
Plus the other than humans, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also interested, you mentioned the stories that
Mm.
need to be heard. What about situations where a person doesn't know anything behind them, as in they don't know where they come from, who they come from, in cases of being adopted, um, or maybe parents dying early and the connection being completely lost um, with the wider family. What is possible then? do you think?
Um, I mean, we're very lucky now that we live in an age where there's DNA testing, for instance, if um, you have no idea of um, your direct lineage. But to get an embodied sense of what it is to be part of something is is a very different thing, and it has a very different um, impact on your body. And that thing of two coming together for um, one to be born is an amazing thing. Um, and that's something you talk about very eloquently when you do the work, is that all of these people who came together in order for you to be born is just such an amazing thing. Um, and irrespective of whether you know who they are or not, this happened, and they're there. All you have to do is just call on them, and they will be there. So getting that embodied sense of what it feels like to be part of something is the first step, I guess.
Hmm. That really makes me think of an effort to step out of our heads.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, sort of the mind really wants to know, and in some ways it needs to know, and in some ways it's good to know. But at the same time, it's not necessary
it's
to
not.
have this embodied experience, as you say, of this, multitudes of people standing behind you. You don't need to know anything about them. Yeah,
No, you don't.
yeah.
And that doesn't mean you can't find out in some way or explore that in some way. I mean, at times I pick a name, an Irish name, like John or Sean or Seamus or Margaret or something like that, and I just write their story, even if the story is a fiction, but
Hmm.
it's a story of how people lived, how they, farmers and fishermen, and women who work the land and men who work the land, and all of that. Sort of just telling a story but attaching a name to it, so it makes it more personal. Um, but it's also embodying that sense of where one came from and what one's lineage might be, um, in a sort of in a fun way. It's quite fun to do, and sometimes I pick, an ancestor like hundreds of years ago, and try to imagine and let it come through the imagination. Working shamanically, that's the whole thing, is allowing the imagination to come through. And, yeah, just telling the stories in that way. It comes down to, um, making that connection to them easier.
Yeah, and it's such a creative way.
Mm.
That creativity is healing, creativity is spirit. So actually, that's exactly the point of stepping out of your head and out of your mind and tapping into imagination, creativity. And also what I thought about, that in that way you're really tapping into the collective ancestry.
Yeah,
What Dan calls the tribal soul.
tribal soul.
Those stories that are almost archetypal, and they would exist in every single lineage in the land, in the country. So you're kind of anchoring yourself in
Mm.
the belonging to the land and to the tribe by feeling those stories and allowing them to come through you and out and on the paper, and having a name to it attached. It feels like such a beautiful and grounding practice.
The one story that came to me was about 12 or 13 years ago. Um, I went to Turkey with a friend, and we did all the sites, and we went to Troy and Ephesus and everything. But we also went to the Dardanelles, and we went to Lone Pine Cemetery. And I didn't want to get out of the bus. I just didn't. But I made myself. And as soon as I put my foot on the ground, I started to cry. Now, I don't cry really, but I cried. And we must have been there for an hour walking around. This was part of the tour to walk through Lone Pine Cemetery. And I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. And people were walking away from me because they were thinking, oh my God, there's a mad woman here. Anyway, I cried and my nose bled. I mean, it really just wasn't pretty. But what I was doing was, I was crying for these boys who were mostly, they were from New Zealand, but they were mostly Irish. And the youngest boy who died and who was buried in Lone Pine Cemetery was 15. So I was crying for the men. And at the time, I, I wasn't sure what was happening. Um, but afterwards, I was doing an MA in poetry at the time, and I wrote poetry. So I wrote about the boys who had been slaughtered. But it was not just them. It wasn't just the boys in the Dardanelles or who were buried at Lone Pine Cemetery. It was all the boys who had been killed in war. And again, it was that sort of colonialism. These Irish boys were in New Zealand, so that sort of whole immigration that had happened because of colonialism in Ireland and because of famine and strife and all of that, and this disconnectedness. So, how these Irish boys ended up in Turkey, buried in Lone Pine Cemetery via New Zealand it sort of blew all my circuitry. But that was a significant and big piece of work.
And it reminds me of what you told me before about working through your body, that this work um, on many levels happens through the body.
It does, yeah. And as soon as I put my foot on the land in a completely foreign country, the stories came up and came through. It comes through the bodies another way, like even just with medical procedures. You know, um, as women, we go through very many different types of examinations. Um, and I've been able to work with some of the female ancestors, so sort of in direct line. When I was having a procedure recently, and I had called in this sort of ancestral help to support me and to be able to deal with the discomfort of it. But then I could feel my sort of direct female ancestors behind me looking over my shoulder saying, oh, so this is how women should be treated. This thing is that I was being held by um, the female doctor, two female nurses, and how they could see that I was being respected
Mm.
and how they hadn't always felt that. And that respect for the female body is not something that's um, shown a lot or hasn't been and still isn't. Um, everybody has an opinion on how women should um, be. And I mean, that's a whole other story. Um, but that sort of female experience of um, being abused and traumatized is something that comes through a lot.
Mm.
And certainly in the clients that I see, there is always that aspect in them. Um, but definitely, if it's not in them, it has been part of that female experience of women who have gone before them.
And I think that reflects a bit this question that we discussed before. What is your life an answer to? You know,
And
the question that I asked, if your life is an answer to a question that ancestors were asking, what would be the question, or what was the question? And that feels like something that shows up as an answer. That definitely, that example with the procedure and the female ancestors being there going, oh, this is how it's supposed to be, you know, that's good to know. And they can, you know, they can take it, they can feel it. I have goosebumps when I'm thinking about it, you know, that through your body you are offering them a different experience of something that potentially was quite traumatic in their time.
I love that question. I really do. And when you posed that question and I got the email, I just knew instantly. Um, but it's that thing where um, the abuse of women's bodies, that's what I am the answer to, is that I'm bringing through the stories. I mean, it's not just me. All my colleagues and people I work with, and everyone, you know, deal with this on some level. Um, but it's that I knew that this was a big piece of the work that I need to do for the rest of my life.
Hmm. And when you say it, say a bit more about it.
I think instead of talking about the trauma, it's probably better to talk about reconsecration. Okay. And that reconsecration back through the family line on both my mother's and my father's side. It's not just the women of my maternal lineage, it's the women on my father's side as well. But this is for me personally. And to track back and reconsecrate what needs to be reconsecrated in in a way where what has happened has happened. That's it. That's not going to change. But the relationship to it can change by blessing and grace and prayer. Um, and interestingly, even though I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, the one way I connect back instantly to my ancestors is to pray the Hail Mary. That's part of the rosary. Because that my mother said that, my grandmothers, my great grandmothers, the men in the family did as well. Everybody knelt down and said the rosary. So that's like a direct connection back, going back hundreds of years. Because at times in Ireland, when the people weren't able to practice their religion, that was all they could do, was pray, was come together and pray. And that was the prayer they said. Um, so while I use lots of other prayers in my work, personally, that's the one I connect to when I want to connect to the ancestors.
Hmm. That leads me to another question. I seem to have many. You also mentioned that during the procedure you called in the ancestors to support you, and now you've mentioned this prayer. What are the ways, like simple ways, for maybe somebody who has no experience of practicing with ancestors, what would be a simple way to connect, to maybe call in? How do you do that? Or other ways to tap into that sense of belonging, like you do with this prayer?
Mm. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I still have that in me, in the lineage, the prayer. I'm not sure that um, that's necessarily the truth for people who are younger than me, um, but there's different ways of doing it. You know, that's just my. I haven't got a great memory, so that's my way of connecting back instantly. Um, but for people who want to connect, I mean, there's loads of different ways. If we consider that, you know, if we're animist and we believe that there's spirit and everything, you can go out and connect to the ancestors by having a walk in the forest, having a walk by the river. And I'll often do that myself and just say, what have you got to tell me today? And something will just bubble up to the surface. You know, as you've said, if you quiet your mind, then the the land will speak to you. Um, Another thing is if you've got something that's troubling you, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, whatever. Again, I mean, I still go back to that the way that Dan describes it of asking someone who looks on you with kind eyes to come forward and be with you. Um, because we need that support and we need to feel that connection. And that when we ask, we will be heard. We may not get what we want, but we will always get what we need. Um, so it's to sort of play around with that, and to have a bit of fun with it as well, because sometimes a lot of our spiritual stuff we can all feel a bit worthy, and you have to spend 4 years doing a retreat in, you know, wherever. You know, this has to be available to everyone, um, as a way of being and as a way of living and as a way of living their lives with that support that's there. And all you have to do is put your hand out, touch it, and you will be seen and heard.
And also the stories that you mentioned before, taking a name and writing a story.
Well, there's so many ways to work with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I write. That's big. Lots of people draw, paint, make a mandala. You know, get some found objects and make a mandala in your garden, or go to the beach and collect some stones, and you know, make the story that way. But it's the intention that's behind it that's important, rather than the actual activity. It's that intention of bringing the ancestors near, and then doing something that acknowledges them and has respect for them and what it is they did in order to survive. I mean, that's a big thing. Lots of our ancestors did not very nice things in order to survive and in order for us to be here. And that's also part of the story.
Yeah. Also part of the story. And in some ways, that makes me think of again, being the ancestor and becoming a good ancestor. You know, if we think about the price of surviving,
Mm.
that many of our ancestors had to pay, and if we think about the future generations and looking back at us, and kind of, you know, looking back at us either as the one who has kind eyes and support and resources, or as the one who had to do difficult things to survive. again, putting this into context of multiple generations, why do you think this work is important, or this way of being, kind of not necessarily working with ancestors, but more engaging with them, maybe personally?
Well, I think first of all, it's that is that no matter what happened, we need to look upon the stories compassionately. Okay. Now, the stories of survival at all costs, they're either mythologized in families or they're deeply hidden and deeply buried. So we need to get a sense of the ones that are very mythologized, well, what really happened? And the ones that are deeply buried is, what are they? And it's to, I guess, work in that place where the where we come from a deeply compassionate place, or to come from a compassionate place, which is where all healing work starts, I guess, where you're looking at something from that neutral place. It was neither good nor bad, it happened. And what we're dealing with are the ramifications of what happened. When I work with the land around here as well, I mean, there's lots of deeply awful stuff that happened on the land around here, again, to do with landlords and colonialism. But even more recent than that, we had a very divisive civil war in Ireland, and where families were pitted against each other, fathers against sons, and mothers against sons, and it was really awful. So that's still coming through the land as well. So sometimes when I journey to the land, it's a matter of sort of just sitting there and observing what has happened, and again letting the story unfold in that space. That's the shamanic journey. Okay. And using it sort of like as a container, bringing it into the circle and letting the story unfold in the circle, letting it come to its conclusion for whatever conclusion needs to happen in that space. And then when you come out, then something has shifted and something has changed.
And why do you think it's important to do this work?
Well, I think in traditional societies, individuals had ways of dealing with things. I mean, if you look at a dog and a dog falls into the lake and it comes out, and this sort of just shakes everything off. Well, that's what we need to do a bit more of, is sort of just shaking off the stuff that gets stuck to us, and it to be dealt with, in a firm way. Um, and I think because we've moved away from that spiritual way of working, things don't get resolved spiritually as much anymore as they did in traditional societies. And, even me, growing up in the 60s in the west of Ireland, people would come together and, you went to mass and you went through the rituals that helped you get through what was often really, quite a tough life. Um, and I think it's sort of bringing that sort of ritual aspect back in, where we can let go of whatever it is that isn't needed. And again, it's not about laying blame. It's just stuff that's stuck there that just needs moving on.
I'm reflecting on many situations where people are not able to return to the land of their ancestors, or the land where they were born, or the land where they grew up, for a variety of reasons. We have such a globalized world at the moment, and with everything that is going on, it might physically not be possible, or economically not possible, or for whatever reasons. What do you think could be a way in such a situation to reconnect with the land and with the ancestors?
Well, I guess no matter where you live, you are still the product of your ancestral lineage. You are. Over the last 200 years in Ireland, there has been mass immigration to American, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK for, all families have experienced immigration in that way. Um, but that connection is still there. You still hold that resonance in your body of your family lineage and blood. And it's more than just the blood lineage, though, isn't it? It's that connection to what's primal, I guess. And you can do that in many ways. You can connect through the myths and the stories. For me, it's important to be back here on the land. I could have existed equally well by not coming back. All it has done is change. Okay. And sometimes we need to strike out and be somewhere else and take what it is that we hold in our bloodline elsewhere. We need to mix it up a bit sometimes. And and that's sort of happening in reverse now. There is immigration into Ireland where it's all being mixed up a bit. And that's very interesting to observe as well. But I think that thing of, I think it's holding the community wherever you end up. It's and keeping that sense of community and connectedness. That's important, even if you are away from. I've got loads of cousins who live in America and Australia and places like that, and they have a deep connection to their Irish roots. But they've married different nationalities. They've married Italians, or they've married Americans or whatever. But they still have that sense of being Irish. Not in an over the top way, but they still hold it. And it's that thing about that sort of intersection between your lineage and where you happen to be in the world, and what that crossover is.
I remember in South Africa, I learned this practice where wherever you are in the world, through the land, through earth, because in essence we all share one planet, and wherever you are, kind of grounding, going deep, going to the middle,
Yeah.
and asking the earth to connect you to all your ancestors wherever they were. Because of course, even when we talk about our ancestral land, it's quite possible that our ancestors, the further back you go, the more kind of dispersed all over the world they were. That the earth herself connects us to our ancestors in whatever parts of the planet they used to be.
Yeah.
Um, and in that way, calling them sort of, let them know that I'm here, let them know where my feet are on
Mm.
this planet,
Yeah.
and allow them to come and be here where I am, because we share one planet, because all the water is connected on the planet, because all the ground is connected on the planet. So in some ways, kind of the planet is the common denominator, that brings us all back in touch together. Anything else that you would like to bring into the space when we're talking about ancestors and your work and your personal practice with ancestors?
I've said this before, but I feel very fortunate that I've been able to make this connection again, um, and to feel that sense of belonging. Um, and that no matter what has happened in my family line, that I'm deeply comfortable with where it is that I am, and where it is and what it is and who it is that I have come from. Um, but also that connection to the earth, and how that is part of that whole ancestral field as well. And every now and again, when we might have a niggle with some of our direct ancestors, and that sort of memory of feeling part of something much, much bigger than even just 7 generations back. It's way bigger than that. And that thing of being able to come into communion with all of that from time to time. But what I also try to do, and I'm not always very successful, but what I try to do with doing it is keeping it simple, keeping that connection as simple as you can make it for yourself by going out for a walk, using the intention, having a question, having a prayer on your lips, um, so that this is the way you are seen by them. So that's the little light bulb that goes on. Ping, she's back. um, and if that's what I hope to do, is sort of um, um, work in a way where that 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 dialogue and that conversation is easily had with the ancestors, because they are just there, even if they're not ancestors who are your direct ancestors. There is an ancestor somewhere who is willing to help you with what it is that you need help with.
Mm.
And that thing, going back to your meditation, that thing of then putting yourself in the position as the ancestor who may do this for somebody down through the line in your descendants, whoever they are. You don't have to have children or grandchildren or any of that. As my teacher Kathleen Matthews says, we have, I think she calls it, we have collateral descendants. So the descendants of your cousins, your brothers, your sisters, whoever. Life goes on.
Mm.
Um, and putting yourself in a position of somebody who, as you say, the descendant can look back on as someone with kind eyes, then that's a great thing um, to sort of be able to feel that might be, I might have the opportunity to do that at some stage.
Mm. That's a beautiful image to end with, that we are all, in some ways, those ancestors who will be looked at from somewhere deep in the future with a request for help, with the request for support and for resources. And because of how grounded and rooted and present we are to ourselves in our life now, we will be able to offer this to them.
Yes,
Mm.
potentially.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah, here's hoping.
But that's the whole point of the work. It of course it's never complete, it's never done. It's always a process, it's always a progress. But hopefully even the fact that we are doing the work is already putting us into a category of those ancestors who are able and willing to
Yeah.
support and to help and to guide and to resource.
And to sort of to keep that movement, it's like going like a super highway in a way, keeping that movement back and forth, so that um, there, so that support isn't forgotten.
Yeah, a relationship.
Yeah,
Thank you, Margot. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation, and it's really, really um, exciting and touching and moving my heart in so many ways. And I wish you all the best in the work that you are doing. And I am sure I'll see you again somewhere.
I'm sure.
Thank you, Margot.
Thank you.